Okay, I think we will begin our event today. Welcome everybody to this very special Security, Gender and Development Institute and Women in International Security event. We will first be hearing from SGDI Executive Director Mustafa, just some opening remarks, and then we will turn it over to our moderators, Monica, Zora, and me, and to welcome our special guest, Dr. Chantal de Jonge Oudraat, and hear from her about what it means to have a gender focus on international security studies and in international security. I am going to share some information in the chat, but we will also begin our simulcast in Spanish as soon as the message from SGDI President Mustafa begins. As a note to all who are here for the Spanish translation, please know that Monica Mendez will be interpreting for everybody. Please enjoy this video from our Executive Director, Mustafa Aryan.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're viewing this live stream. My name is Mustafa Aryan, and I'm the Executive Director of Security, Gender and Development Institute, or SGDI. SGDI is an international network of experts producing research and events focused on gendered analysis of international security topics. This event kicks off a series of SGDI fireside chats discussing topics on gender, security, development, and peace building around the world. We are happy to partner with Women in International Security for this first event in our 2021 series. I know there are viewers joining us from all around the world. We are delighted to have all of you here with us today in discussing the importance of gender dimensions in international security studies, in a conversation with Dr. Chantal de Jonge Oudraat, President of Women in International Security, or WIIS. We have added her biography in the chat for you to view. Dr. Chantal's recent book, The Gender and Security Strategies for the 21st Century, examines 10 traditional and non-traditional issue areas, focusing on how gender affects security and how security problems affect gender issues. Often gender is overlooked in security studies and in practice. But how this can be remedied and why should it be incorporated? This event will highlight Dr. Chantal's illustrious career as a scholar and practitioner of gender and international security by discussing her recent book and the status of gender in international security studies as it stands today, with a focus on bridging the gap between academia and policy. We will start with a keynote address moderated by SGDI leadership, board members and senior researchers, Meta Singh and Zuhra Abdullah, and the program manager, Monica Mendez. We invite you to participate in a few audience polls throughout Chantal's remarks. After Chantal's remarks, we will then have a Q&A session moderated by SGDI's Deputy Executive Director, Kayla Magdil. We invite you to take part in this event by asking a question in the comment section, and you can also engage with us and with each other on Twitter with today's hashtag #GenderSecurity. Please also keep an eye on the chat as we will be providing links and information there throughout the program. We are delighted to welcome you to this program this morning, this evening, and I am delighted to welcome Dr. Chantal to provide her keynote address. Thank you so much, Chantal. I turn it over to Monica, Smita, Zora, and Kayla to begin our program.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. I am going to turn it over to Monica right now.
Thank you, Dr. Chantal, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So my first question, and I will say first the survey, because we're going just to start, and I will read it, and although I suppose it's going to be projected in the screen as well. So our first survey is how And I want you, for all the audience, to think about it. How impactful do you think the WPS agenda has been in the area of international security? And here it is. So for all of you to start wondering about it. And thank you so much, Mustafa. We are thrilled to be here with Chantal today. And Dr. Chantal, could you please give us a quick overview of what a gender perspective means in international security? And where do you see gender dimensions playing a role in current security issues, specific topics?
Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you very much, Mustafa, Kayla, Zora, and all the other members of this new network as SGDI. You know, I really want to congratulate you on this initiative. You span the world, and I want to say a particular thanks to Mustafa. And also, Mustafa, we are thinking about you, particularly in these very difficult times in Afghanistan. Also, I think Smita Singh was supposed to be here, but is unfortunately sick. And Smita, I hope you will recover soon. So it's great to see all of you here. And Monica, you asked me, you know, what is a gender perspective? You know, gender perspective basically looks at the impact of gender on people's behaviors, their social roles, their opportunities, etc. I mean, we all know that gender is not about sex, but that it is a social construct, that it is about the social meanings we attach to masculinities and femininities. And of course, these social constructs, these social meanings have developed over the course of human history, and they're being passed down from generation to generation, not just from people to people, but also through an array of social institutions such as the family, the church, the school, etc. I think there was an American sociologist, Candace West, who said it very well when she said that gender is not a simple property of individuals, but an integral dynamic of social orders. And power is central to understanding social orders and relations between people. And power is also central to understanding gender. You know, as we argue in the book, gender really structures power in every arena, whether it's education, economics, politics, security, and at every level, whether it's at the local level, at a national level, at a regional level, or a global level. And so a gender perspective or a gender lens or a gender analysis can help to uncover and see those power relations and the resultant hierarchies. Now, if you ask me, you know, are there issue areas where gender is more important? I would say, you know, gender is important everywhere. The main premise of our book is that gender equality and national and international security are really interconnected. You cannot fully understand one without the other. And we also argue that this is a two-way street where gender equality enhances security and security enhances gender equality. And it's really of importance in all issue areas, whether they are traditional security areas related to armed conflict, terrorism, or the more human security issues related to migration, development, etc.
Thank you, Chantal. That answer was very interesting. I hope my network is well enough. And your last point was really interesting to me because it is a two-way street. And the first thing to do in any post-conflict society is to address gender, and you can't have a fundamentally post-conflict rehabilitated society without having addressed that first step. So I think Kayla has the results of the poll. Would you like to share that,
Yes,
Kayla?
we do. I am sharing them right now. It looks like the #1 answer to how impactful the WPS agenda has been in the area of international security was less impactful than it could be, which does make sense. But I thought it was interesting. It was also a no on very impactful. What do you think about those results, Chantal?
Yeah, so I think actually these results really show that this is a story of the glass half full or half empty. It is a story of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think what is hopeful is the fact that increasingly people, policymakers, at least talk the talk of gender and have recognized in their rhetoric that gender and the women, peace and security agenda in particular is really important. The issue is, of course, the implementation of this agenda. And I think that's why you see, I think it was 36% of people who say, it's not as impactful as it could have been. And I would situate myself also more in the glass half empty than half full camp.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're completely right about the impact and the implementation, how they go hand in hand right there. Thank you. That's the results of that first poll. So we'll come back with our next poll in a few moments, but I turn it over to you, Zoa.
So I have another question for you, Chantal. In the course of your career, you've worked in various sectors. You've been in the academic sphere, you've been with the UN think tanks, and of course, as president of the WIIS. So what has been your experience incorporating gender into your work in these different spheres? And is there an overarching theme that you would say was similar across all these sectors?
So if you ask me what is the sort of overarching thing, the overarching thing is that people in all these different sectors do not pay enough attention to the role of gender. And in particular, when we're looking at international security issues. And I think one of the things that I realized, and this is particularly true, with the end of the Cold War, is that the kind of analytical frameworks that we had at our disposal were just not able to help explain the world that we were living in at that time. And it's at that time that I was starting to look at the role of gender, and the role of gender, particularly the dimension in terms of power and unequal power hierarchies. I mean, ultimately, I think, and that is true for all of us here, why do we study political science? Why are we interested in international security issues? And I think there, the overall thread is that, and I don't want to sound corny, but I do think it's true that we all want to make the world a better place. And we do that by trying to better understand what is going on in our world. And so I think a gender perspective is absolutely crucial to be able to understand what is going on in the world today, and also to change the world.
So I think kind of moving on with that, Chantal, you have changed the world quite a bit, I think, with this recent book that you published. We are going to quickly just show our second poll that kind of goes along with this, but then we have a couple of questions regarding that. So here for our audience, this is our second poll, and we're going to focus on we have a question for you later, Chantal, because you do talk about obstacles and drivers to progress in your book, but we want to know what you think one of the biggest obstacles to progress in the realm of gender insecurity is today. So we're going to leave that up while we ask you some questions about your book, and we'd love to hear more about it, Chantal. So this book you published, it's Gender Insecurity, the Gender Insecurity Agenda, Strategies for the 21st Century, and the link to learn more about that book, as well as to purchase it if you would like as well, is in the chat. We would love to hear a little bit about the inspiration behind it. This is obviously a huge undertaking to write a book on gender insecurity and what can be done moving forward, but it's very important as well. So we'd love to hear the inspiration behind writing and editing and gathering all this information for it.
Yeah, so the idea for this book really came out of frustration. Frustration, first of all, by the very framing of the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a women's agenda. And sort of the continuing lack of understanding that gender doesn't equal women. The second frustration was, particularly with regard to the WPS agenda, was this narrow focus on conflict. Instead of looking at broader security issues, and in particular human security issues, migration, human rights, etc., climate change. Third frustration had to do with the lack of connection between the WPS agenda on the one hand and the broader gender equality agenda on the other, including the 1995 Beijing Platform of Action, including CEDA, the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination Against Women, the SGIs, the development goals. So the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. So all of these agendas that are clearly connected were all sort of on different, separate, siloed tracks. And then lastly, the frustration was the huge gap between rhetoric on the one hand and implementation and practice on the other. And then maybe one more sort of frustration was that when I looked at the literature as a whole, there wasn't really a broad comparative analysis of gender in international security, a book that really had a common framework and trying to contrast and compare, what is going on within different issue areas. So that was sort of, the initial impulse to do this book. But I have to say, this book would not have been possible without an extraordinary team of scholars and very well-known scholars in their field. Because what we were asking these scholars to do is to provide us with a track record of the past 20, 30 years, what has been going on in terms of gender equality and the integration of gender perspectives in each of their fields of expertise in each of these issue areas, and to do that, in one chapter. We were very lucky that we got an extraordinary group of really very well-known experts in their field to really work together. And I think one of the things that maybe distinguishes this book from other books is that there is a common framework. Everybody has worked from that common framework, and this is not a sort of a disparate book of different essays on different issues.
Thank you for that answer, Chantal. I do want to ask you something as a student and as a young practitioner as well. The question that always comes to my mind when I read something about security, what can I do, you know, as a young person, because I'm nowhere near in a stage of my career where I could have made the kind of impact that I think needs to be made. But on the other hand, it starts here, right? So what advice would you give? How can we advance research analysis and as well practices in the field of gender and security?
Well, I think you have a huge role, and you're already are exercising, you know, your power by organizing this new think tank, this international think tank, by being critical in terms of the international security challenges that we're facing, by asking critical and tough questions. And so I think you already doing what you know, what you can. And I only hope that, you know, some of the things that we're producing at WIIS, including this book, will provide you maybe with a framework of how to think about these issues. But I think the most important thing you can do is keep pushing, keep asking the tough questions. Because if we don't do that, then, you know, we might as well give up. So, you know, keep asking those tough questions.
Thanks, Chantal. Kind of following up on that, how do you recommend that people do use the gender and security agenda at universities or young practitioners? It's like you said, the framework is so structured and so well set up for people to be able to have a very concise and very good view of what is going on, and then how things are progressing or not, or the best ways forward. But how do you recommend that people at university or young practitioners incorporate the knowledge learned or shared in this volume of yours into their work?
Well, I think if you are in a university or academic setting, do integrate a gender analysis in your analysis, integrate these gender perspectives, ask yourselves questions, you know, what impact does the policy that I'm proposing have on different people? You know, does everybody have access to different resources? For instance, now in the COVID crisis, we've seen how extremely gendered the impact of this disease is. The impact of the disease is really also very much dependent on the social conditions in which people live. So ask those questions. If you work in bureaucracy, same thing. You know, the kinds of policies or programs that you are being asked to carry out or to implement, ask yourself that question. What does this program want to do? Does it reach really all people that it is supposed to reach? Hiring mechanisms, are we reaching out to the right communities? It's really not that difficult and that complicated. But you do need to stand still for a moment and say, are there maybe other ways of how we can do this? Or are we asking the right questions? And it's certainly not a, you know, let's do as usual, or we've never done it this way. Yes, most institutions haven't taken a gender perspective into account when it is in terms of defining policies, programs, hiring mechanisms, etc. And so that requires an effort from the leadership of your academic program or your bureaucratic program. But I think there is sufficient research these days that show that also when you have more diverse people around the table, you'll get better decisions. And ultimately, when you're working for a commercial sector, the bottom line is better. You know, go to the World Economic Forum. They've done several studies like that. McKinsey reports have shown this. So I think the data is there, but some people just need to be made more aware of the importance of diversity and of having a gender perspective.
You led right into actually the results of the poll that we're going to look at, that second poll we took. So this was the question on one of the biggest obstacles to progress. And I'm really glad you mentioned that about there is enough data, it's just about people looking at it and knowing what they're looking at. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Chantal. It looks like the majority of people said that there's a lack of effort from key actors is one of the biggest obstacles to progress. And the second was that gender isn't accepted as important. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think the lack of effort, that is about political will, right? And if you think that, you know, in the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about how gender is really also about power. People just don't like to give up power. And so, you know, it's that political will to really change. Change is difficult for people. And it does require change. So I'm not surprised by the results, and I'm actually encouraged by the result, because if we know what the obstacles are, then our answers and our responses on how to change things will be more effective, hopefully.
I can agree more. And actually going into the next question, which is looking at how your book looks at obstacles and drivers of progress. And you've touched on this a little bit, but that also talks about strategies. What were some commonalities that you found in the different subject areas from the book? What were some main commonalities between obstacles and drivers, as well as strategies for progress?
Yeah, so, you know, part of the framework of the book is that we asked all the authors to identify what the main obstacles are to making progress on the gender equality agenda in their particular issue area, what the main drivers of progress are, and then based on that to come with some strategies. And we looked at 10 different issue areas, and we thought, well, we'll probably see some variation amongst issue areas, and particularly, you know, we're looking at conflict on the one hand and economic development on the other, or human rights. Honestly, I thought we would see some variation. But I think that the most interesting finding was that the obstacles and drivers, the obstacles to pushing gender equality initiatives and the drivers that push gender equality initiatives are basically the same across issue areas and across countries. And that's, I think, a very, you know, interesting finding. Of course, you know, the obstacles to progress can be more formidable in some countries or in some contexts than in others. They may vary in form a little bit from one issue area to another. And the specifics may vary, you know, a little bit from place to place. But the patterns are really common across all these functional issue areas and across countries and regions. And in the book, we you know, identify 5 main obstacles to progress: the patriarchy, inertia and resistance to change, thing we talked about, misconceptions about gender and what it means, and then money and data. And then in terms, if you look at the drivers, we again sort of identified 5 main drivers. And the overarching driver are people like you, civil society organizations who say we need to change. International organizations have also been very important. Progressive governments who are setting good examples. And I'm thinking in particular here of Sweden, who launched a feminist foreign policy. I mean, in the beginning, when Sweden did this, when was it, in 2000, what was it, 2004? No, 2030. Anyhow, when Sweden did this, you know, everybody, and I'm living in Washington, D.C., in particular in Washington, D.C., you know, all the policy community was saying, oh, stupid Swedes. And, you know, they were poo-pooing this whole idea. But then others followed, you know, France, Australia, and the latest one is Mexico, who in January of this year announced its feminist foreign policy. And so, you know, that example is actually has been very, very powerful. Laws and regulations are, of course, essential. And then lastly, I would say scholars. And again, you know, it's sort of people like you who do research and, you know, collect data and provide the analysis.
One thing that struck me was that there is a very much a leader follower type thing, but there's a lot of difference between top down and bottom up approaches, and sometimes people think it can only be one or the other, but as you were just saying, it needs to go both ways. There needs to be change at the top and there needs to be change at the bottom, and also in that middle section that very much is an overlap with both of those. There needs to be functional change.
Yeah,
So,
I think you're absolutely right, Kayla. This is not a question of bottom up or top down. But I will say that if you don't have buy-in from the leadership, you won't go anywhere. So leadership is important, both, I would say, at a national and global level, as well as at a more, you know, in your daily life. Look at the organizations in which you're working. If your leadership is not on board with these issues, you're not going anywhere. That is not to say that it isn't important also to look from the bottom up and educate people from the bottom up. But the two really have to go hand in hand.
I agree. And this leads us to actually our next section, kind of focusing on bridging the gap. So I am going to launch our third poll. We invite you to fill this out. This is, what do you think the greatest challenge to bridging the gap between policy, academia, and practices? This is a huge question, and we're going to try and dive into a couple of the nuances in it. And I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, I've seen a couple questions coming in the chat in the Q&A section. Please send them in. We are also going to be moving to a Q&A portion after just a couple more minutes. So, but kind of looking at this idea of bridging the gap, one of the missions of WIIS and SGDI is to bridge that gap between the academic or theoretical part of it and the policy and practice. And it's always a topic of conversation. It's always something that people focus on and strive to overcome. But where do you see specifically the WPS agenda either failing or succeeding in this regard? And how have those successes or failures changed or remained the same in the past 20, 21 years that the WPS agenda has been active?
So that's a big question you're asking there, and particularly when we, you know, we look at the WPS agenda. I would say here actually the glass is maybe more half full than half empty. There's been a recent study from LSE looking at the national action plans, the national implementation plans of the WPS agenda. And what we see in that study is there is a slight tendency towards broadening the concept of security. You know, increasing number of NAPs will talk about climate change, will talk about migration issues. And I think that is a very positive development, so that we look at security in a more, you know, comprehensive manner. so that's one. But, you know, at the same time, we've also seen, and we started talking about that, you know, these frustrations that I had wanting to do this book had to do the fact that the gender community itself was also kind of split and siloed. You know, there were people working on gender equality within the SGDI context. There were people who were working on WPS. There are people working on security, but not necessarily on gender. And then we've seen also the, you know, the adoption of a youth, peace and security agenda. And I thought having a youth, peace and security agenda was actually kind of a failure of the WPS agenda, because I think if the WPS agenda is a progressive and forward-looking agenda, it has to be an intergenerational agenda, and carving out a little piece of youth, peace and security, I thought was not the right way to go. But, you know, then you have all sorts of other constituencies who want to push that. So one of the important things, and you have that also in your survey, you know, how do you bridge those gaps between different issue areas, or say practitioners and scholars, academics? And I think one of the ways you do that is indeed vocabulary. You know, we have to speak and write in language that is comprehensible to everybody. Sometimes academics, you know, go into very jargonly kind of language. You sometimes also have to translate your more, you know, complicated analysis into actionable issues that policymakers can do something with. And so I think we all have to be very careful, and I would say that's particularly true for those who are in academia or in think tanks, is that we have to think about the language in which we write. Is it clear? Is it understandable? And we have to think about what it means in practice when we are advocating for a certain action, or when we do a certain analysis. What does that mean in practice? What kind of actual steps policymakers can make, and be precise when we define such steps. You know, it's not sufficient to say, oh, we have to change this. Provide a specific example how to change that, and also provide some small examples. You know, is there some low-hanging fruit where people can have easy, quick successes?
Thank you, Chantal. I agree completely, especially about tailoring your the way you present your research to the people who are the practitioners, basically. Do you have any predictions for what our poll might say? Because Kayla is going to share the results with us now, but let's see if you have any predictions.
Well, I would say, I would say the vocabulary and the silos are probably.
Let's see, Kayla.
Well, you were partially correct. Actually, only one person thought that vocabulary was a big thing. I kind of think that vocabulary makes a lot of sense, because if you can't, like you were saying, if people that you're talking to don't understand what you're saying, there's no point in it. But the siloed areas was a big one as well. And I think, interestingly, the lack of guidelines or initiative for working together was great. And we had a comment from one of our audience attendees, Emily Sample, hello, and they said, I think that the gap is due to funding issues. There's a desperate need for funding in both sectors, and the grants and funders don't encourage or allow much cross-pollination. And I think that her comment speaks a lot to what you were saying, Chantal, for providing specific examples and looking at specific needs for what is going on and having that specific language. But what do you think about these results?
Yeah, so I'm a little surprised by lack of guidelines, because guidelines by whom? So if it is meant, lack of incentives of working together, and that goes in line with what Emily was saying, there's not enough funding. We all talk, and it is particularly true in an academic setting or in, among philanthropic organizations. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity. But what we've also found is that it's actually very difficult to do interdisciplinary work, because the way academia or, say, funding organizations are organized is along, very specific pillars of work. And if I have, say, I'm a philanthropic program officer, and I'm in charge of nuclear security, why should I go and talk with, say, the women's program or the gender program if I haven't seen, the interest of cross-pollination there? Because why should I take away money from my pot and give that to? So I think institutions need to be better organized to encourage interdisciplinary work. And that is true, I think, in think tanks, but it's also true in bureaucracies. But what it means is that you also give away, you're going to decentralize. So you're giving away some power. And I think that's where, the structural difficulty lies.
You've already answered. Sorry, Killa.
I was just going to say, I agree. I think that's great. I was just going to say thank you for your comments on that as well. Go on, Sarah.
So I think you've already addressed part of our next question, which was exactly about this. But one thing that hasn't been addressed yet is a lot of times policy practitioners and academics are in the same room and they are talking to each other, and yet no progress is made. So is that possibly because of the different goals and priorities that they have in their respective fields? Do you think that plays a factor as well?
Yeah, of course, obviously, people have different priorities and different perspectives. But if you're in the same room and around the same table, you are in that room or table for a purpose, and that is to solve an issue. And it is, one can hope that you are of good nature and that you really want to solve the issue, that you're not sitting there just to wait out your turn and think, well, I let the others get so tired and then I'll sweep away whatever I can. So if you're in that same room, you have to be open and you have to lean forward to the other and try to understand where the other comes from.
So I think that we have just a final question before we turn it over to our audience Q&A. We've had some great questions kind of rolling in and some great comments as well. Thank you so much for all of your engagement. Please continue to send your questions in during this last question that we ask. So Chantal, looking at kind of an overarching summary of this, what is, in your opinion, one of the main things that can be done to address these gendered implications in international security today, but to create and foster real change for the future? I know that's a very broad, overarching question, but in your view, in your experience, what is one of the most important things that can be done or should be done?
So I don't think there's one single thing. I think And you will have noticed a pattern here. We go by fives. And so our strategies for progress are along, the 5 Ps, 5 priorities or principles that should guide any action or program. And the first principle, that it has to be about people. Security ultimately is about people, it's about us, our security, and not some kind of, abstract notion of security. Second, particularly when we're talking gender perspectives, it has to be about parity. The one single thing that people really understand about gender is numbers. And here the numbers, we have to push for greater diversity. And I would say we have to push for parity that is 50%. The third is it has to be about perspectives. And we've talked about that you have to integrate a gender perspective in your analysis. And all programs, policies, etc., have to integrate a gender analysis. Fourth is, we have to be focused, all of us who want to move this agenda forward, on policy. And policy in all its aspects, whether it's, agenda setting, whether it's implementation of policy, or whether it's monitoring of policy. But we want action. And so that's why the focus has to be on policy. And we have to be able to, play both offense and defense in this arena. And then lastly, I think, and we talked about this before, when we talk about gender, we talk about power. And we have to realize that power is something that people will not easily give up. And I think we also have to realize that this is not an agenda that will make, that will change from one day or another. I think this is a multi-generational campaign. There's always possibility of backsliding, and we've seen that in the past few years. And that's why we have to keep up pushing, but being cognizant of the fact that this is about a basic principle of how we organize our society, and that is, power and hierarchies. So we have to keep that in mind. And so that would be my sort of the 5 Ps you want to keep in your head when you're thinking about these issues.
And actually, I think a couple of those 5 Ps are a couple questions that people have as well. So I am going to quickly just launch our very last poll. This is kind of our final thoughts, but and we will review this after the Q&A portion. So please take some time to share where you think you will apply these things you learned today. And if something is not on this list, please feel free to share it in the chat. We'll read them out. We'll be really happy to talk about them as well. Looking at the Q&A portion, one of the things that you talked about, Chantal, was looking at gender-based analysis. We've had a few questions come in, and we had a couple questions that were submitted before the event, focusing on gender-based analysis. One, I think, sums a lot of the focus of this up very well. And it says, gender-based analysis is indeed important and more people need to be aware, but what is the best way to train people to be able to conduct a comprehensive gender-based analysis? And I think that's a very key question.
So I think universities and academic institutions, etc., should train people in how to do that, how to do a gender analysis. And, it's not that complicated. You can do gender analysis of an institution, you can do gender analysis of policies or programs, and it is about asking questions. Who is this policy intended for? What does it do? When? Why? For whom? What's the impact of a policy or a program on different people? Men, women, transgender, children, the elderly, the disabled, etc. Who makes decisions about these policies or programs? You would want to look at funding. How is funding allocated and why? How is access organized? Who is pushing certain policies or programs and who is opposing? So it's about, asking critical basic questions. But then again, go back to the 5 Ps. It's, our ultimate objective is about gender equality, equality for all, and equal access and opportunity for all, because hopefully that will lead then also to gender justice.
And I think that one of the things that some other people have talked about or asked in their questions as well is looking at specific areas of, for example, Estelle Genato said, how do we use the gender dimension when researching on violences and conflict? And I think that some of the things you were saying just barely were, of course, it's creating that framework, looking for who's making those decisions, who it's impacting, looking at the people part of it. And I think that do you have anything else to say about specific?
Yeah, so for instance, on conflict, I mean, that's actually kind of easy. If you look at the WPS agenda and UN Security Council Resolution 1325, I mean, between 1325 and the WPS agenda initially, there are 2 main ideas. One is that is about participation, and that when we're talking about peace and security issues, we have to involve everybody, and not just the fighting parties. We have to include everybody, including, in this particular case, women who were excluded from these negotiating tables. So that's about participation. The other issue that was, of course, central to 1325 was the issue of protection, and in particular, protection of sexual violence in conflict. People sort of became really horrified by by the way sexual violence was being used as a tactic of war. And that sort of got a unanimous consent from the international community that this was really beyond the pale of us, working and acting as human beings. So, there are a whole array of issues, but participation and protection, and participation in determining where are we going, why are we fighting, and making sure that, everybody is around that table and has a say.
We're seeing a lot of comments and questions come in about the people who are with the decision makers or the people who are in the room talking about these. We have a couple questions saying during closed doors negotiations, there's a high level of resistance from a number of countries. It's a lack of incentives more than lack of guidelines. Looking at focusing on, we had a great, I think, comment from Lindsay Bainbridge saying, looking at when Turkish President Erdogan met with the EU's Commission, there were 2 presidents who were a woman and a man respectively, and both of the male leaders were seated at the head of the room with the 2 gilded chairs, and the woman leader was left standing and eventually guided to sit on a couch really far away from the fellow leaders. But what the questions are kind of, I think, summing up is that Lindsay so accurately summed up. So do you think that this issue of not having a real chair was an intentional message of women in the global stage, or do you think it can underscore the aims and importance of the WPS agenda, looking at during closed door negotiations versus open door negotiations, high levels of resistance, or as Lindsay was saying, that subtle resistance of, oh, you don't have a chair here? What do you think is a way that can overcome this issue of being there in the decision-making sphere and having people in practice and policy be able to not just during closed doors or open doors discussions, mitigate that resistance?
Yeah, so, resistance and pushback, we've seen that. And we've seen that in the world. Not only, we've seen it here in North America, and I'm thinking the previous administration was really very anti-gender equality. Latin America, Bolsonaro, Duterte in Asia, Erdogan, of course. And I think the incident in Turkey with Michel and von der Leyen, that was not an innocent incident. And von der Leyen in particular, the woman, the European leader, the head of the European Commission, really did not see this as, oh, oops, there was a little mistake. She actually, the maybe silver lining of this event was that she became more aware of these issues and how deeply entrenched they are. And in our book, we have a table of sort of, how this pushback happens. People like Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, etc. I call them sort of the neo-patriarchs. And, the tactics of these neo-patriarchs are well known. They will sideline the agenda. They will talk the talk, but not walk the walk. They will talk about, we have to preserve and restore. They will let in a token number of women, but not sufficient number. They will also often set women up for failure. They are very good at sweeping things under the rug. And then, of course, lastly, if necessary, they will close the ranks and oppose you directly and actively. So I think this pushback and resistance and active resistance, and sometimes really violent, ugly resistance, we see that also in a lot of election campaigns. The violence against women who are running for office is incredible. And this happens not just, in the developing world. This happens also in Europe, in the US. It is a universal problem that we're faced with. And a lot of this violence is happening also online. But that doesn't mean that it is not a big harm. The fact that it is online doesn't mean that the harm and the violence is real. And so I think we have to be, very cognizant about this and call it out every time we see this happening.
We have another question from you from one of our attendees who's looking forward to reading your book. And they ask, how does your book complement gender in international security of Schoberg, if I'm reading that right?
Schoberg?
I think so.
Yes,
Yeah.
and maybe more broadly, how it complements in other gender and security work.
Yeah, so I think, the book really builds upon the enormous work that has been done by feminist scholars like Ann Tickner, Cynthia N. Lau, Schoberg, Valerie Hudson, etc. And what what the book contributes is having this broad comparative analysis across these different issue areas and with one common framework. So we're looking at conflict, post-conflict, terrorism, migration, human rights, governance issues, development issues. So across a broad array of issues with, common sets of questions. And we hope that through, sort of plain language, this is a book, I think, accessible to a lot of people. And you don't have to be versed in theoretical underpinnings of gender theory to be able to understand what is going on. But Laura Schulberg is, she's a student of, a former student of Ann Tickner, and has done an enormous amount for the field to move this forward. And she has also been some of the people who has really tried to engage the traditional security community. Another person I think who has done enormous work and has made an enormous contribution in the field is Valerie Hudson. I think she has made the issue of gender really palpable for policymakers by collecting all these quantitative measures and data. And I mean, Kayla can talk more about that. She worked very closely with Valerie Hudson and Women's Stats. But if you can prove, if your negotiating table, etc., is more diverse, your policy decisions are going to be 70–80% more effective. That speaks to policymakers. And I think she and others have really shown that there's a very strong correlation between gender inequality on the one hand and national and international security on the other. And I think, if you ask me what has been the most important academic finding in the past 50 years or so, I would say that is the most fundamental academic finding that was made these past few years. And scholars like Ann Tickner, Cynthia Enlow, Valerie Hudson, Schoberg, and others have been extremely important in doing that. And Jackie True, for instance, and Tara Davies, they published the WPS handbook, and you will see a lot of people there, scholars and practitioners, reflecting on the different aspects of the WPS agenda.
I think adding to that, Chantal, your book, like you were saying, is written in a way for people to be able to understand these concepts of these, these seminal works and be able to apply them very well. So I would also add your name to the people that you were just listing off as people who have done much to change this area. And I think our last question by Helle, I want to make sure I'm saying your name right, Nielsen, she agrees. She said, "Thank you for your scholarly contribution. I've quoted you in my own work," which is great. But her question was, or their question was saying, when it comes to advancing gender equal countries, how can we convince them that continued progression is important and needed when they think gender equality has already been achieved or sufficiently achieved, and now just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up? And is this area, in your opinion, important to tackle? And this will be our last question, then we'll talk about the poll and wrap up.
Yeah, so, what I would say is there's no country in the world that has achieved full gender equality. And so, even in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, etc., there are gender inequalities. And so people within those countries have to continue to push their governments to make more progress. And I would also say, and this is particularly true for the WPS agendas and the national action plans, a lot of the national action plans on WPS, particularly from donor countries, Northern America and Western European countries, have always been very outward focused because they've always been very focused sort of on conflict, and they thought they had no conflict within their countries. A lot of these NAPs are about what happens somewhere else. And I think it is very important that if you really want to push gender equality elsewhere, you have to start at home. And it was very interesting, the special representative to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for Women, Peace and Security, Mariette Schuurman, I think she was the second special representative, always said, you know, if we want to push this, we have to start at home. We have to start in our own institutions. And it's actually, you know, talking about NATO, it's quite interesting that a military organization like NATO has been quite extensive in its policies, but has been lacking a little bit in terms of implementation. And she put the finger on, you know, that implementation fact. And so I think for all of us, there's lots of work to do within our own countries, within our own institutions. And I think we want to work on these issues, you know, constantly. And we've been focusing a lot on gender, but we also know that gender is intersectional, and that, I mean, my hope is that by looking at gender and doing a gender analysis, we also recognize other inequalities that are existent in our systems, in our organizations, in our society, that have to do with, you know, race, ethnic background, age, etc. And so this will make us more aware of every individual within our societies and institutions.
And I'm glad you touched on intersectionality, because that was another question that we didn't have a chance to get to. But I want to quickly share the results and get your thoughts. As a reminder, this was the where will you apply everything we talked about and learn today in your life? And we've received a few comments from people saying that they want to apply it everywhere and that it's so important. And I totally agree. But what do you think about this? I'm very encouraged to see that the top one was leadership skills and training.
Yeah, I think this is very encouraging, and I think it should be, you know, across the board. And we do it, you know, in small and little things. We do it in our everyday life. We do it in our work life. We do it in our policy engagement and in our activism. And when we do that, hopefully we will make this world a better place.
Well, I just would love to say thank you so much, Chantal, for joining us today. It's been very enlightening, and I've really enjoyed listening from you. Zora, thank you as well for attending, or not for attending, for moderating this. Do you have any last words that you would like to say, Chantal, before we finalize this?
Well, my last word is congratulations to all of you. I think as SGDI really proves that this can work. You are an extremely diverse and international network, and I wish you all the best, and know that in WIIS you have a staunch supporter, and we will provide any help and support we can to your network. And I think it's a fantastic initiative. And congratulations to all of you to do this. We need people like you in the world.
Thank you very much, Chantal, for joining us today. It was lovely to meet you as well, because I think I'm one of the only people at SGDI who had never spoken to you before. And I would really like to thank Monica, because what she's doing is not at all easy, simultaneous translation on this platform. Thank you, Monica.
And I was going to say, Monica has been talking this whole time, translating it from Spanish. So thank you very much for that. As just a final note, we will have this recording and everything up on our websites, and we will send an email out with a few key points as well. So thank you, or a link to our websites and a few key points after this event. Thank you, Chantal. This has been an amazing over an hour of conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all for attending as well. And we look forward to working with you and talking with you soon. Bye.